In conversation with Michael Chandler, Dr. Michael Chandler's boyhood in a dysfunctional family during the apartheid era in South Africa provides powerful grit for his transformational personal journey as told in his award-winning memoir, Karma and Kismet, a spiritual quest across continents, cultures, and consciousness, published by Koehler's book, July 2024. Kirkus Review called it a thoughtful, emotionally forthright, and engaging retrospective. Mike is a multiple published author as well as a co-author with his wife, Nina Shandler, of several books including The Marriage and Family Book, A Spiritual Guide, Ways of Being Together, A Complete Guide and Cookbook for Raising a Vegetarian Child, all published by Schocken Books, New York. Lesson in Leadership about Chandler's experience as a young white boss during apathy was published in Chicken Soup for the Soul at Work. Chandler's graphic novel, co-authored with Michael Egan, Vroom, Charged Teambuilding, was published by the American Management Association in 1996. Former Author D. Little principal and partner, an independent practitioner for many years, Chandler's professional consulting brought him into the inner sanctum of leadership in both private and non-profit organizations internationally. Michaels holds a master's in counseling psychology and family therapy and a doctorate in leadership and organizational development from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Chandler is an avid cyclist and lover of nature and animal, husband of over 50 years, father and grandfather of five incredible grandchildren. And on today's episode of Auto Interview, it's my utmost pleasure and joy to offer the show today, Michael Chandler. How are you doing, Michael?
Great. Thank you, Peter. Nice to connect.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, and I need to say you have such an amazing and lovely bio.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very nice.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, Michael, I must say that I am taken aback while I read through the description page of your striking memoir, Karma and Kismet, a spiritual quest across continents, cultures, and consciousness in Amazon. I'm curious to ask you, how does this book come about? What inspired you to write Karma and Kismet?
Well, when I started to write it, of course, I didn't know the title, but I knew that I knew I had a quite a remarkable story because by the time I really got serious about writing it, which was about roughly 10 years ago, I was old enough to realize I had gone through something in my life and through difficult human things that, namely conflict and challenge, real, intense challenge, um, and specifically the conflict with my father. And I realized that I had carried around with me what I began to call father hunger, a hunger to connect with him. And so that is a big thing that drove the story, and a remarkable series of events, of circumstances, of coincidences, of even miracles, I would argue, occurred that essentially went from, I'm talking about, violent conflict, violent and ugly family breakup, to 16 years estrangement on different continents, and then some seemingly miraculously coming together and deciding to go forward after not having any contact for 16 years, and creating a relationship uh, of how can I say, of rapprochement, of reconciliation, of doing the best that you could, full acceptance of the other. And I went on a pretty wild ride to find and satiate, what I'm calling father hunger. And of course, it was more than father hunger alone. It was a kind of I came to understand after some events happened to me when I came to Canada, specifically in 1968, that really changed my life and gave me a completely different perspective than I'd had before. So, and then I discovered the meaning of the word spirituality in a kind of a, extremely non-denominational sense of that word, and more in the sense of unity and oneness of all religions, and that it doesn't really matter. What matters more is the inner connection with the spirit, and it doesn't matter really what path you're on. It depends on where you're born. It depends on a lot of things, but so it was kind of that sort of spirituality that I came to through, I must say, in retrospect, again, a set of quite remarkable circumstances, and that took me far afield. That took me into the Eastern realms of yoga, Hinduism, and where I was really steeped strongly for about 10 years, and hence the karma part of the name. And then I'll just go ahead and talk about the Kismet part, because that's more difficult for most people. But I want to read you from the section of the book that I actually call Kismet, which is the third section of the book. And I said, part 3, Kismet, call it Kismet, fate, bashert, destiny,
Yeah.
ordained, meant to be, grace,
Destination.
providence, the hand of God, whatever. But things sometimes happen for mysterious, deeper reasons. Kismet's origins found in Turkish, Arabic, and in Hebrew. And direct meaning, a portion or allotment. So the way that I used the word Kismet in the book, and by the way, it's not, my book is not a heavily intellectual book at all, but I am a lover of language, and I came across a lot of languages in my time, and there were certain words that stuck with me. Kismet was one of them. There are many other examples in the book, but Kismet was one that stuck with me, that the concept of karma, which, as you know, means action, didn't quite do for me. And then in Kismet, there is a sense of an unseen hand, perhaps orchestrating things behind the scenes that one doesn't know about or see, and that makes certain things happen in one's life. And that without, you can honestly say, looking back on it, wow, amazing. That must have been some kind of, I don't want to be grandiose here, but some kind of divine hand, something that you can't see, that's not visible, and yet amazing things, happen. So yeah, so there were certain events that happened after what I will call, part 1 of my book is called Karma. And the analogy that I used in part 1 was Shakespeare. How does it go? Double, double toil and trouble. Double, double toil and trouble. Fire burn and cauldron bubble. And that's part 1, karma. And that Shakespeare's quote really, in a way, kind of sums up what was going on. I would call it, I would even call it bad karma, if you will, as opposed to good karma, because a lot of pretty hard, challenging things happened. And so my book is part memoir, part historical, kind of analysis of a particular time and the places that I happen to live in, and what, and how those places influenced me. Part 2 of the book, by the way, is called Seeking. And the reason I called it Seeking was because by the time I emerged from apartheid South Africa, which was I was 20 years old, and I won't go into any details unless you ask me specific questions of what happened. But I can tell you that even though I was born into privilege and I was white, I had a pretty tough road to hoe because I was Jewish. And there was a long history in South Africa of violent anti-Semitism. So, and we were just post-war, post-World War II, and the Afrikaners were aligned, many of the Afrikaners, I should say, were aligned with the Germans during the war, with the Nazis. And
Wow.
they themselves, the Afrikaners, had a long
Wow.
history of animosity toward the British. And I should say vice versa. The British hated the Afrikaners and the Afrikaners hated the British.
Oh,
Both
yeah.
settler groups, but they had even gone to war with one another. As you will remember from your history, the Anglo-Boer War, pretty famous one. That was in 1899 to 1902. So they had come out of that war, which the British won in a very, very, very tough way. I mean, they burnt down, parts of the whole kind of Northern Cape Colony and the Transvaal and the Orange, so-called Orange Free State. They
Yeah.
burnt down the homes and farms of the Afrikaners, and they took a lot of them prisoner, and they put them in concentration camps. The first concentration camps that we know about 100,000 of them, and 27,000 plus older middle-aged women and children died. And the Afrikaners never forgave the British for that. But
Wow.
after the war was over, so there was a lot of animosity and bitter feelings, between the two groups, even though they were both white, and out of necessity, they needed to stick together because they had what was called in South Africa at that time, in Afrikaans, die swart gevaar, the black danger. So every kid knew that term, die swart gevaar.
Oh.
Um, so I mean, there's a whole chapter when I was conscripted into the South African Army 10 days after I finished high school. I was in the South African Army, and I did not want to be there, but
Oh.
there I. And so I don't want to give away what happened, but I can
Yeah.
tell you that
Yeah.
it was
Yeah. I love your
very, very,
answer. Absolutely.
yeah,
I love your answers to that actually. And that sounds very amazing and quite lovely to me. So thank you. Thank you for
yeah. And the
sharing.
Kismet is really about the last part of the book is really about the kind of amazing blessings that came after the rough beginning that I had. And believe me, if you read it, you'll see that there were unbelievable blessings that I could never have imagined in my wildest dreams. Because by the time I left South Africa, they had conditioned me to think small. They really had, in many ways, a very narrow, rigid system. And I mean, I was fortunately, because I was Jewish, I never felt the racist thing. I mean, I identified with Black people because they were like me in a way.
Oh,
Uh,
that's
yeah,
amazing. That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. And also,
yeah,
Michael, in your book, you painted a detailed portrait of your pain due to your father's rejection and your
yes,
fear when you face anti-Semitism. This
yes,
also coupled
yeah,
with your disappointment with the political wrangling of yogic faction. I would like you to
yeah,
tell us a bit more about this and how it makes you feel that you have to include it in your memoir.
yeah, yeah. Well, I want to separate the yogic faction piece from the younger piece with my father, because the piece with my father, what I refer to as father hunger, really is I would say, a major arc in the book. And it went something like this, and I'm going to be very simplistic now, but there are graphic details, and I give you a reader warning beforehand. I did not pull any punches in my descriptions of violent example. And so the book is very intense, around things like violence. I'm not just talking about it, I'm really bringing the reader into it. And so violence was I lived in a violent home until I was 13. I was afraid of my father. My father was a World War II veteran, by the way, and
Oh,
my mother was a survivor. She came from a survivor family from the Holocaust. My mother was born in Austria, and she met my father. I'll just tell you this quickly. She met my father in Palestine, where she and her family had been rescued and taken to from Europe. And my father was a soldier in the British Eighth Army, and he met my mother. And in 1945, they were married in Tel Aviv. And then my mother went with my father to Cape Town because he was a South African, Cape Town, and I was born the next year. That's how I came to South Africa. So, so, um, so the situation with my father was that he was extremely erratic, violent, could go off like Mount Vesuvius, And the thing was that you never knew when it was going to happen. So, as a kid, as a little boy, there was nothing particularly, remarkable about me. I was a kid. I loved sport. I love what boys like. I like going fishing. I like going to the beach. I like girls. But I like to get out of the house because I was afraid of my father. And I got out of the house as much as possible. So, uh, when I was 13, I began to do very badly at school. I had never failed a class, but when I got to grade 8, first, which was the beginning of high school for me, I was at the oldest school in South Africa, the South African College School, and I failed Latin in the first term. I got 19% on the multiple choice exam for Latin, and which was a very big disgrace because, as you know, Latin is sort of the subject that most sort of symbolizes British colonialism, or so let's say successful British colonialism in Africa.
yeah.
So I had failed Latin, and my father didn't really know what to do with me. And so he sent me to a school in a faraway place in the desert of the Cape Province, about 300 miles from Cape Town.
Wow.
And that was known for only one thing. It was the ostrich capital of the world. And between 1870 and 1919, I'll say the First World War, and 1914, there was a phenomenon in women's fashion worldwide, namely that women of all kinds of women like to wear ostrich feathers on their heads, and they wore ostrich boas around their necks and so on. This was a huge fashion, and ostrich feathers became worth more than gold by weight, just to give you a sense of how valuable. And Oudtshoorn, this place that I was sent to, my father sent me to, had been the world ostrich capital between 1870 and 1914. Now, I got there in 1960, and it was an Afrikaner place. And as a English speaking South African, I really had never actually even met an Afrikaner. And here I was in a place where they didn't speak English and I didn't speak Afrikaans. So that was a very, very big challenge. And since they were Afrikaners, several of them, not all of them, but many of them were very anti-Semitic. They simply had nothing to do with me as a person, but that didn't help me. I was still persecuted and beaten up, and a lot of violence and so on. And there's some incredible adventures that happened to me during that phase in relation to that, which I won't get into here. But so when I came back from boarding school, after several years of being in this place, I could speak the language. I could now speak Afrikaans fluently. I came back to Cape Town only to be conscripted into the army. And again, I won't go, I hate to do this, but I won't go. I don't want to spoil it for readers. What happened in the army was amazing in itself. And then I was a young guy. I was out of the army, a young guy, and my father arranged for me to go to Joburg, to Johannesburg. Joburg, as we call it. Maybe you guys do. I do too in Nigeria. Do you call it Joburg or Johannesburg?
Johannesburg.
Johannesburg, okay. So we called it Joburg just for, that was the local slang. And it was a big city I didn't know. Cape Town, where I was from, is a beautiful city, but it was in those days, it was kind of a sleepy backwater. Ships weren't going around the Cape anymore to get to India. They were going through the Suez Canal. So Cape Town was kind of a backwater. But then I got to Joburg, and I was kind of a bit of a naive fish out of water, and very unhappy there, depressed that my job was not what I was told it was, and so on. But then in 1967, something very, very dramatic happened. And because I was Jewish, I followed it extremely closely. So the war in the Middle East broke out, very topical subject today.
Mm.
But this was the well-known 6 Day War, so-called 6 Day War. And after the war was over, which I followed, I mean, I tried in those days, you had to have a shortwave radio in order to get any kind of news, and relying on newspapers was, already 24-hour-old news. But the radio, shortwave radio, particularly BBC, was really quite good. And
Mm.
so we were always, wanting to listen to the news, and I followed it very, very carefully. And after the war was over, the Jewish agency in South Africa said to Jewish boys actually Jewish kids like me, go to Israel and lend a hand in the wake of this war. You'll be helpful to just go there and live on a kibbutz and lend a hand. So I volunteered. And the next thing I knew, I was living on a kibbutz in Israel. And that was a huge, huge transition experience for me. And during the time, I realized, and I mean, I had many adventures and many eye openings. I'll just give you one example. A couple that lived on the kibbutz, who had a young family, were assigned as my kibbutz parents. So they were supposed to be keeping an eye on me and so on. And the husband of the couple was a high officer in the IDF, in the Israeli Defense Forces, and he took me up to the Golan Heights, and I saw, this was very shortly after the war, and I saw a lot of destruction there. Obviously, a lot of people had been killed there, and a lot of destroyed tanks and guns, and God knows what. And came to me a very strong existential question. Do I want to stay here? I know I don't want to go back to South Africa, but do I want to stay here when I know very well they'll conscript me into the army? And is this what I want? And at that stage, the answer came back no. It was not what I wanted. The question was, well, what do I do? If I don't want to go back to South Africa, I don't want to stay in Israel, where do I go? And then it came to me that my mother had two brothers who lived in Canada. They had
Oh,
also been they had also been rescued and taken to Palestine, but after they were, young men, they had both left for Vancouver, Canada.
I actually love your take on that, actually. Thank you so much for giving us a little background into how all of this developed in your memoir.
Yeah,
And also,
yeah,
I'd love to ask you, as a lover of memoir and deep works of literature myself, I must say that your title name captivated me the most. Maybe because I have a similar title to the name of
I
Whose
saw
Fault,
that.
Kismet and Impediment, which I have a copy a bit far. Yeah.
Yeah,
But when I first saw your title, Karma and Kismet, I was like, hmm, looks like you're about to divulge some profound and mind-blowing works here.
yeah,
I would
yeah,
like to ask you, how do you choose your title, Karma and Kismet, if that's something you love to talk about?
yeah. As I said before, the karma was really what I went through in South Africa. Then I had the long phase of seeking, and then I came to Kismet, which was where a profound, and I really mean this, you can see it for yourself in the book, and every word of it is true. Profound series of blessings came in the form of a sense of purpose in life, in the sense of education, in the sense of a family, a wife and a family, in the sense of going from real poverty. And I mean this, yeah, again, I came from privilege, But when I came to Canada, I was poor as anybody, poor. And I went from that poverty to really, I don't want to say that I'm a rich man. I'm not a rich man, but I have everything. My family, we have everything we need. And that's enough. So that's what the Kismet part is about, is those
Wow,
blessings.
that's amazing. I mean, that's lovely, and that's such an amazing and thoughtful, name to give a book. That's quite
Thank you.
lovely.
Yeah.
And now, Michael, what impact did taking psychedelic drugs have on
Ah,
your personal
you want me to tell
transformation?
you this in, you want me to tell you this in 3 minutes?
I'm afraid so.
I'll just say this, okay? I don't know, what the norms are in Nigeria or where maybe your listenership, is all over
Most
the
of
world,
United States, actually. Yeah.
mostly in the States. Okay, good. So, I'll just say that, as I mentioned, I came to Canada in 1968. I formed a relationship with a professor, and one day he said to me, "Hey," he said, "come over to my house on Saturday. I want to take a mescaline trip with you." And mescaline, as you may know, is the active ingredient of peyote. And I had heard and read about mescaline. I knew that the Mazatec Indians had taken it in their ceremonies for thousands of years. And all the kids around me, all my peers, were doing LSD or mescaline, usually LSD because it was easier to get. Mescaline was actually more difficult. And of course, magic mushrooms, which grew in British Columbia, where I lived. I mean, they grew wild. You could find them in the fields. Um, so I went to his house, my professor friend. He gave me the mescaline, and nothing happened for about 20 or 25 minutes. I was just sort of relaxing and kind of, I was sweating. I remember sweating under my shirt. I was pretty nervous. And then all of a sudden I felt some force power that was far, far, far more powerful than I was, take me over. And I was puny in terms of my strength or ability to handle this power. I lost control. I really did. I was trying my hardest to control myself, to control my experience of this power, but it was futile. And in the book, I talk about the metaphor that I used was a sense of being enveloped by a python, and that the coils of the python were wrapped around me, and I was being squeezed more and more and more. And finally, I realized I'm not strong enough. I'm not strong enough to deal with this. I'm going to die. And then it came to me, because the squeezing didn't stop. Then it came to me, you're going to die. Surrender. You cannot fight this. It's too strong. The only thing to do is, if you're going to die, then die. And that's what happened. I surrendered, completely surrendered. And when that happened, everything changed. It was as though my vision opened up, as though my ears opened up,
Wow.
my sense of smell. I began to experience what's called synesthesia at that point, which is a crossover of the senses, where you see a note of music. You don't just hear the note, you actually see a color or a pattern that goes with it. It's amazing. And so I began to have this very, very profound experience. But the biggest part of the experience was the realization that there's a power or a force. Some people will call it God, other people will call it, radiant mind. There are many, many names for it. People will call it Allah, people will call it Jehovah, people will call it Jesus or Christ or Buddha. But there's a power, a higher power, to which that is always present, actually, and that one must learn. One of one's jobs in life is to learn how to reattach oneself to that power, to realize that one is a part of that greater power that pervades everything and everywhere and everyone. And so began a real big change in my life, which is basically that I got more serious about my spiritual path, and I got into yoga and meditation. And I met up at that point with Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass, and I became his road manager for a time. And of course, he was Timothy Leary's famous cohort at Harvard. And they had started the Harvard Psilocybin Project together. But when I met him, he was already Ram Dass, and he was wearing all white yogi. And he introduced me to the man that became my very serious yoga master from India, who came to California. And I spent five intense years with him, and then another five more peripherally. But so
Wow.
that's the impact of the psychedelic experience for me. And there were many other things too, but that's the sort of the heart of it, if you will.
Wow, that's quite amazing, really. I mean, I enjoy listening to this, and that's quite lovely to get to know how this is very deep, very, very deep, emotional, powerful,
Mm.
and cooling. Thanks for
Mm.
sharing. How did it impact you being sent to a school where you couldn't speak the language and were
Yeah.
bullied?
So, I was 13 years old when this happened to me. And, you don't realize when you're 13 or even really at any age that you're going through something. You sort of, at some point, you sort of decide, I've got to make the best of this somehow. I have to survive. I've got to, of course, you have to make a commitment. In this case, I made a commitment to learning the language. Even though, honestly, the Afrikaners were not my favorite people, and they were cruel to, as I said, they were cruel to Jews, cruel to boys like me. And so I didn't like them particularly, although there were many exceptions to that. I did make some friends, and I did learn that not all Afrikaners were anti-Semites. Some were lovely people, just like anybody would be. It's difficult. It took a commitment in the beginning, and I'm going to do this. And it took a lot of going through a lot of trial and error, because it took at least a year and a half for me to actually master the language so that I could, converse, so that I could understand what people were saying and so on.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for sharing. Thank you.
Yeah.
And also, apart from Karma and Kismet, do you have any other works you've authored or say currently working on?
Well, my story, Peter, is that when I was in my early 20s, which was in the 1970s, and then in my early 30s, which was the 1980s, I managed to get 4 or 5 books published. And Schocken Books in New York took the first book, which was called The Marriage and Family Book, a spiritual guide, which really was me being the kind of the host editor, if you will, and hosting a lot of teachers and teachings from different spiritual points of view about the subject of marriage and relationships and family life. So that was the Marriage and Family Book. That was the first one. And then I did another one, also published by Schocken, called Ways of Being Together, which was about relationships and how to improve your relationships, how to mutually grow in a relationship, and so on. And then I played a minor role in another book that my wife was the major author on, but my name was on it, called Yoga for Pregnancy and Birth, which was about how to use yoga to prepare for a natural home birth. And then together, Nina and I did another book called The Complete Guide and Cookbook for Raising Your Child a Vegetarian, which of all the books that we did actually turned out to be the most successful, because Ballantine Books bought it, and it went into mass market paperback, and it sold over 50,000 copies in mass market paperback, which was a great thing in those days. And I'll just add that although it might sound like we were very successful authors, the truth is that by my mid-30s, I was already a father with 2 kids, and
Wow.
money coming in from the books was not enough, and I had to look for another way to make a living. And then the Kismet part, a series of amazing, and I'm going to call them miracles, happened, in which I went from being a guy who had less than 2 years of college to being accepted into graduate school. And I was able to get a master's degree and a doctorate without having a bachelor's degree. So I call
Wow.
that to me, that's a kind of a miracle, but that actually happened. And
Wow. That sounds like a
yeah,
lot. Sounds like a roller coaster.
it's all in the book. Yeah, no, it
That's quite
is.
amazing. Thank you. Thank you
Yeah,
so much for sharing, actually. I love the sound of it. Thank
yeah,
you.
good. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and also, following on the publication of a memoir, how does it make you feel knowing that your story is out there, right at the tip of the finger of everyone in the world? How does it make you
So
feel?
it makes me feel okay, It's something that at first there were some parts of it that were difficult, where I was writing about my relationships with, for example, with my father who got remarried. And I know his second wife. In fact, she's only 10 years older than me, and I kind of grew up with her. She and her parents lived a mile from my house, so I knew who she was. And and then my father, when I was about 20, my father married this woman. My parents got divorced, and my father married this woman. So I had, it was difficult to imagine how she was going to take my depictions of my relationship with my father. And I basically decided at some point that the most important thing was that I wanted to show that it's possible, that it's possible. It might be rare, but it's possible to go from a really violent relationship with one's father to a place where you come to some kind of peace and you take responsibility for your side of things, such as they are, and you value peace above your own hurt feelings, above your own anger, and so on. And I must say that eventually, in my late 60s, I came to realize that I had a remarkable story because I have a successful story in that regard. And not only a successful story, but an amazing story, and that it should be captured, and that if there were, and that you needed to understand my story in context. And if you understood it in context from beginning to end, I think, in fact, I know I've been told this a number of times now, that it really opens people's hearts, and that it's a story of, it's a very, very real story, but in the end, it's a story of deep compassion. And I don't mean that I was a compassion, it was not me, that there was a compassion in which my father and I fell, if you will, kind of something bigger than ourselves that protected us and opened our
Wow.
hearts to one another and made a really big difference. So yeah, like that.
Wow, that sounds like a lot, really. Thank you so much for sharing. I love hearing about how it makes you feel. Thank
Hmm.
you. Thank
Hmm.
you. And just in case we
Yeah.
have some viewers who are currently watching this interview, I would love to get a copy of your book. On what platform is it available on for purchase?
Yes, it's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and Books a Million.
That's amazing. And I left a link in the description part of this interview where interested viewers can get a copy of Michael Chandler book directly on Amazon, Barnes& and Nobles, and also another platform. So thank you so much, Michael, for accepting the
Thank you,
invitation
Peter.
to be
Thank you,
featured
Peter.
on P English Literature. It's awesome, and I must say it's more than wholesome even having you on the show today.
Thank you, Peter. Awesome being here with you.
Thank you.